Welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that I normally don't really like to talk about, it, that is defend our people against all kinds of accusations that are made by our enemies. You know, throughout history, we were told all kinds of bad things about ourselves, and most of them ended up completely untrue and more than untrue, just libelous. But this particular accusation bothered me for a long time because it was supported, it seemed to me, like by high-level Israeli officials that took almost very close part, that were at the scene at that time, and that bothered me. And I was very glad to have come across this book that was recently written by our guest, Professor Eliezer Tauber of Bar-Ilan University. And you can purchase it. And in fact, not only can, but I think if you care about such things, you should buy it. It's available on Amazon. We're going to give a link to the book below this video. And we'll ask Eliezer, questions that a normal person would have regarding the situation. But before we start asking him questions, I'm going to read a little segment of an article that was recently published in Haaretz by Gil Troy about the event that we're going to be talking about. I'm reading here. Deir Yassin, or Deir Yassin. For decades, it was the main count in the Palestinian indictment against Zionism and Israel. That's what Gil Troy writes. In 1970s, when Palestinian terrorists butchered school children and Olympic athletes, they and their supporters cried, "Remember Deir Yassin." In the 2000s, when Palestinian leaders blew up the Oslo peace process by dispatching suicide bombers to Israeli buses and cafes, they and their supporters cried, "Remember Deir Yassin." Even today, the massacre of 254 Arabs, including 25 pregnant women, 50 breastfeeding mothers, and 60 other women, followed by mass rapes and other atrocities in this pastoral village just outside Jerusalem, remains one of the prime movers of anti-Zionism and often invoke justification for the rejectionism and crimes of Palestinian extremists. In their still defining book on 1948, O Jerusalem, Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre describe Jews cutting open a pregnant woman's stomach with a butcher's knife and slashing at least 2 people from head to toe as they killed and looted. That is their quote. Then, quote, another quote, then finally raped. Now, the wars over ownership of land are always especially vicious, and the losers pay heavy price. However, it bothered me a lot when I heard of rapes of women and purposeful killing of children by Jewish members of Irgun and Lehi in that village. It's one thing to kill an armed enemy, but it is an entirely different thing to rape women and kill unarmed children. This event, which enemies of Israel call a massacre, is one of the foundational stones of the Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic. It lies at the center of Palestinian Arab identity. Today, we'll let you, our viewers, be the judge of whether it is in fact what we are accused of really happening in Deir Yassin, formerly Arab village, as I said, in April of 1948. Now, we have invited to take part in this discussion, an honored guest, Professor of Bar-Ilan University, Eliezer Tauber, who will comment on these things and respond to our questions. Professor Tauber is one of the leading experts in Arab affairs. He spent 5 years researching the Deir Yassin event. The conclusion of his research is succinctly expressed in the title of his new book, The Massacre That Never Was. However, I'll try to stay as objective as is possible for me in determining if Israel was indeed born in the sin of Deir Yassin, or the Deir Yassin Massacre is a vicious blood libel that cannot be accepted by any reasonably minded person. You, our viewer, can always leave your comments and questions below this video. Eliezer, welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for stopping by. What I propose we do now, we'll let the accusers make their accusation, and then you'll comment on that 2-minute video that we'll show, and we'll start with that. And then we'll also allow at least one of the living witnesses to tell us what he saw and how he saw. It's also a video. And then we'll talk about it. You'll talk about it. You'll tell us what is right and what is wrong about it. And then we'll have a third little video of defense side, that is from another Jewish channel, defending the position that we as Jews would like to be thinking, to feel, and then we'll talk about the things that you found when you were researching 5 years. You know, for a person of your caliber, is tremendous amount of time to spend on a book. Obviously, you would not have spent that time if it did not bother you as well, at least in the beginning.
Thank you.
So now, why don't we start with the accusers?
בשבוע שעבר ציינו יהודים ופלסטינים במהלך סיור זיכרון 67 שנים לפרשת דיר יאסין. מה שנראה כאן כישיבה תמימה של תנועת חב"ד היה עד לשנת 48 אחד משני בתי הספר של הכפר הפלסטיני דיר יאסין, היום כפר שאול, שכונה ירושלמית. בדיר יאסין נטבחו על פי הערכות שונות בין 80 ל-110 תושבים, בהם נשים, ילדים ותינוקות, על ידי אנשי הלח"י והאצ"ל. על פי התיעוד ההיסטורי, ההגנה הייתה מודעת לעומד להתרחש ואפשרה את המעשה.
עאישה רדואן, סבחה רדואן, מוחמד זהרן, פאטמה עיד. מה שקרה בדיר יאסין זה לא המקרה היחיד, ולא החריג ביותר, ולא הראשון ולא האחרון.
בספרו של סלמן נטור, הזיכרון שוחח איתי והסתלק, שהושק במהלך הסיור, מתוארים מקומות נוספים שגם בהם בוצע טבח כגון רמלה ואילבון.
הוא התמוטט על האדמה אל מול כל האנשים והחל לפרפר כמו ציפור גוססת. התקרב אליו הקצין כבן אקדח לראשו ורוקן לתוכו 5 או 6 כדורים. היריות הפחידו את האנשים, דרשו מהם להרים ידיים, הפחד שבר את ליבם.
העובדה שחבורה כל כך גדולה של לוחמים יהודים ב-48, 3 שנים אחרי השואה, יכלה בכזו קלות לעשות דה-הומניזציה לילדים, לנשים, לתינוקות, מעוררת בנו את הצורך להבין באיזו מהירות הדבר הזה יכול להתרחש, וכמה קשה אחר כך לעקור את זה מקרבנו. ומי שרוצה שיהיה שיח ושיג על זכויות אדם וזכויות אזרח במזרח התיכון, לא יכול להוציא לא את ישראל ולא את הציונות ולא את הממשלה הישראלית מרשימת הפושעים שמבצעים פשעים כנגד האנושות כמו אחרים באזור הזה, והדרך היחידה כנראה למנוע אסונות כאלה בעתיד היא להחזיר את ההומניזציה, להחזיר את האמון בכך שמי שעומד מולך הוא קודם כל בן אדם.
Okay, Eliezer, please.
Okay. Because I know this organization, it's called, usually it's called an enterprise of Zochrot. Now, it is shameful that even the notices that they posted there with the names of those killed are mostly incorrect. Many of the work is so clumsy that even if they want to commemorate names, they don't even have the ability to know the correct names. And I already read an article of one of the granddaughters of one of those killed in Deir Yassin who complained to the organization why even you couldn't spell the name of my grandmother well. This is about their ability to write history, including Ilan Pepe with regard to Deir Yassin. So basically everything that was said there had no significant connection to the reality which happened in Deir Yassin in 1948. What happened in 1948 was the relationship between Deir Yassin and the adjacent Jewish neighborhoods were problematic for many years, and eventually the two minor Jewish organizations, the Etzel, which is also called Irgun, and the Lehi, decided to conquer it in order to, as they believed, to free the road from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, because Jerusalem was under siege and they wanted to open the road, and they believed that Deir Yassin is endangering the road. Now, this was one of the main reasons why they decided to attack the village. Contrary to what one may believe, the village was not a defenseless village. First of all, the village knew...
Eliezer, we'll get to it, but let's just focus on their accusation. They say that, in fact, they compare this to what happened to Jews during the Holocaust, during when almost 6 million Jews had been exterminated. That is number one. And number two, this Ilan Pape or Pape or whatever it is, however he wants to pronounce his name, which is a very nasty, I would say, anti-Semitic, a Jewish anti-Semite, leads this excursion. And he says that Israel basically has no rights to talk about human rights or democracy or say anything about other countries in the Middle East. Obviously, he can do probably something like this in any Arab country, but he doesn't. And another thing, what you saw there, we did it purposefully. There was one guy, an Arab guy, standing next to this Pape, and he had a map of land of Israel as one land. And I'm sure he did not mean that was land of Israel. Obviously, or probably he had in mind that it was supposed to be Arab land to which Jews have no relationship or the right to claim.
Well, I will comment. I very much like to comment about the first point that you made, the comparison between Deir Yassin and the Holocaust. Now, many of those Palestinians who don't like my book already commented on Amazon on the book that I'm a genocide denier. Now, they were modest, perhaps because they are not Jewish, so they wrote genocide denier. There was also several Jews who expanded it and said that I'm a Holocaust denier. They compared it to the Holocaust, Deir Yassin to the Holocaust. Now, let us say, for the sake of the discussion, that indeed 254 people were killed in Deir Yassin and many women were raped and everything was correct. If you are comparing this to the murder of 6 million people, you yourself become a Holocaust denier. Namely, all those who say that this book is a Holocaust denial, it turns themselves into Holocaust deniers, even if it was correct. Let aside the fact that the Holocaust was and the massacre in Deir Yassin was not. It never happened. And if you wish, I will later on tell you what did happen.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we're going to, But can you comment on what I said, that map on the chest?
I will tell you something about that map. One of my PhD students, who is a Palestinian, wrote a PhD dissertation about the prospects of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. He is a Palestinian, now he is already a doctor, he got his PhD. And the conclusion of his dissertation was crystal clear, namely, the Palestinians will never agree to a two-state solution. From their point of view, the Israelis are robbers, they robbed them of their land, and when the Israeli left is asking them to be satisfied with only the 67 borders, it is an immoral position, namely that the position of the Israeli left in their point of view is immoral because they want the entire robbery back, namely the entire land in the borders of 1948. This is what the Palestinians want today, and this is not a dissertation that I wrote, but a Palestinian student of mine who was able to travel throughout the Western Bank. He didn't dare to go to Gaza because it's very dangerous, even to Palestinians, but he went everywhere, to child camps, to tents of mourners, to politicians, to imams, to religious sages, and the result was everywhere, in every stratum of the Palestinian population. We will never have peace with an Israeli state. The entire land of Israel belongs to us.
And when the three generations of Jews had been expelled by Ariel Sharon from Gaza, they had a place to go. If something like this, God forbid, will happen in the Israel where Jews now live, where do you think those Jews will go?
Well, I have some relatives in the United States.
Okay, so you have American passport?
No, I don't. But what do you want me to answer you for that? I mean, the answer is self-obvious.
Okay. In any case, let's take a look at the eyewitness testimony of white eyewitness who was at that time a little boy in Deir Yassin, and see what he says.
Just 2 miles from Kastal lay the Arab village of Deir Yassin. Early in the morning of April 9th, the same day as the funeral of al-Husseini, fighters from the Irgun set out for the village. Deir Yassin was one of many Arab villages that had signed a peace agreement with a neighboring Jewish village, so they did not expect an attack. The Haganah intelligence officer who reported on Deir Yassin was Mordechai Gichon.
Deir Yassin were only citizens. The village was completely peaceful.
أخوي رحمة الله عليه محمود ضرب، سمع الصوت ولا ضرب من هكا منطلق، ويعني 12 ساعة متتالية وهم يقاتلوا اليهود.
A number of Arabs died resisting the attack, but a far larger group lost their lives well after the battle had ended. In all, Jewish fighters killed about 110 Arabs at Deir Yassin, most of them women, children, and the elderly.
People were mutilated. Hand grenades were simply thrown into houses. Women and children were killed, bodies stuffed down wells, jewelry stripped off fingers, fingers cut off, earlobes cut off.
رحت أنا ماشي بهرك الحيط مش من الشارع الرئيسي، من البساتين. الفرن له شباك على جهة، ولا اليهود في الفرن، والنسوان قعدات على الأرض، وكل واحدة قاعدة وحاطة إيديها على راسها هيك، وبقولوا للفران ارمي ابنك بالفرن، ارمي ابنك بالفرن، اسمه حامد. قال له أنا ما برمي ابني. قال له شوي. هم ضربوا الحاج حامد على راسه ومسكوا الولد رموه بالفرن. أنا شفت هالمنظر، شفت هالمنظر ما تمش فيها حيل من مرة. يعني بعدين مسكوا الأب حطوه وراه، قالوا له الحق ابنك. أنا جيت عديت قلت هلا بيمسكوني قمت أركض.
After the massacre, they took the people which remained, they took them in a car and went through Jerusalem.
Irgun trucks full of survivors paraded up and down streets in Jewish neighborhoods. Spectators mocked, spit at, and even stoned the villagers.
It was very ugly. After these things, I did not know if I am a Zionist.
After the attack, the Haganah sent men to cover up the atrocities.
They came to me and gave me a platoon of soldiers and told me, go there and make order. And so I came there and I was shuddering because I see how the dead were strewn and they were eating sandwiches with marmalade. For some time I couldn't eat marmalade after that. And then I told them, look here, I'm going to fire and shoot and kill you if you don't clean this up. And so they made graves and buried them, and a few they threw in a well, and everything was apparently clean. And then everything looked peaceful.
But the massacre was not over. Some villagers remained in Deir Yassin, hiding in their homes. For 2 days, Irgun fighters searched for survivors.
مروا مرتين ثلاث ما عرفوش والله ما شافونا لولا الولد صار يبكي. أخذوا عزمي صرنا نبكي لأنه ولد أدنى. قال هذا بيبي رجعوه. كمان شباب صفوهم على الحيط حوالي 15 واحد ورشوهم قدامنا. إحنا حملونا في بيكب. لما وصلنا المنطقة اللي بين العرب واليهود طلع لي واحد عينين زرق حلو شخصية محترمة أبو 18 سنة. قلت له بالله عليك أنت عربي؟ قال تفضل ما تخافش أنتوا عند العرب هلأ.
Most of the images of the Deir Yassin massacre are in the archives of the Israeli army. The archive refuses to release many of the images and intelligence reports on Deir Yassin, despite being well past the 50-year embargo for classified documents.
Eliezer?
Yes. What do you want me to start with?
We start wherever you like.
Okay, so the first things that the Arab witness said were correct. Namely, he admitted that they fought not for 12 hours, it was a battle which took for about 10 hours. And during the battles, all those who were killed only during the battle. The stories that people were killed after the battle is a legend. Now, he mentioned few people I know because he is from the Radwan family. Indeed, there was one family which was shot by one soldier, which later on becomes a nucleus for the massacre narrative. A family, one of his friends came out of a house. One of his friends was shot seriously by a fire from one of the houses there. When the family later on surrendered and they came out, he shot them. This was the only case in Deir Yassin where some of the soldiers shot.
The whole family or only men or a woman of the family and children?
It was a family. However, if we are dealing with stories that most of those killed in Deir Yassin were just old people and women and children, this is not correct, because what I did was something which was unprecedented before my book. Namely, I didn't just look for stories or testimonies, but I look for verifying the names of all those Arabs killed in Deir Yassin. And then in the second step, I verified the exact circumstances of death of all those Arabs killed in Deir Yassin. And first of all, I managed to find that 42% of the people killed there were men and not children or old people or women. Furthermore, 24 of them were armed combatants. So the story is that only women and old people and children were killed is a fake. It was a battle, and during the battle, either that people were killed because they themselves were combatants, or because they were relatives of combatants who were besides the combatants. I will give you an example, which might explain the entire situation. For example, there was a house attacked by some Lehi fighters, and they asked the people to surrender and to evacuate the house. At first, there was in the house 1 woman and 5 men. The woman was the first to come out of the house with a white flag, and she is later on the one who will tell the story. This is how we can know how we know the story. She came out and surrendered. Later on, the 5 men decided also to come out and surrender. However, one of them was holding a rifle. He was an armed combatant. He was holding a rifle. He was also apparently not very smart. Instead of leaving the rifle inside the house, he came out the house with a rifle in his hand. The moment that the Lehi fighters saw that a group of 5 people coming together from the house and one of them is holding a rifle, they throw a hand grenade. They did it in order to save their life. I mean, they could just kill him, but he could shoot at least 1 bullet and kill one of them. So instinctively, they throw a hand grenade. The hand grenade killed all 5 of them. Now, I know from the testimony of the women who remained alive that they intended to surrender. But from the point of view of the Lehi fighter, they saw a group of Arabs going from out of the house, one of them holding a rifle. Now, they wouldn't have the time to tell them, go away, just let us kill the one with the rifle. It was a matter of life and death. One of those Lehi fighters could be killed. So they did what probably every other one would do the same. They throw a hand grenade in order to secure their lives. And then all the 5 people who came out of the house, it was a Jauda family, doesn't matter, they were all killed. Now, from my point of view, one of them was active combatant, and 4 of them were people standing beside an active combatant and killed in what I called combat conditions. So, I'll give you another example. A grandmother is shooting with his rifle through a window at the attackers. Now the attackers want to silence the fire. So they threw a hand grenade into the window. Beside the grandmother was a baby, a granddaughter of this grandfather, a baby of aged several months, and she was in a cradle beside him. The hand grenade killed both him and the baby. Now, you cannot say that the baby was massacred because those in the outside even didn't know that the baby was there. Then you only one thing, that someone is shooting at them from the window and they threw a hand grenade in order to silence the fire. So as tragic as it is, from my point of view, this baby was not massacred. She was killed in battle conditions.
Now, one of the people that this video shows, Gihon, he was with Haganah. He says that in Deir Yassin, there were only civilians and that village was completely peaceful.
So I succeeded to speak with Gihon several months before he passed away. He's not alive anymore. He passed away several years ago, and I managed to speak with him. And I can tell you explicitly, he didn't know anything about what was going in the village. I spoke with him. I heard what he knew. He knew nothing. For example, he believed, like many other people, and I will explain you why he believed, that the village was defenseless, without any arms, or maybe just some few old Turkish rifles. This was incorrect. No one knew in advance that it was incorrect. Why? Because a month before, the village sent a mission to Egypt to purchase weapons. And the mission managed to come back to Deir Yassin only 5 days before of the attack, because they were delayed by the Egyptian intelligence. They bought the weapons in the black market and they were arrested and they were freed only they arrived back to Deir Yassin 5 days before of the attack. And they brought with them huge amounts of arms, 2 Bren machine guns, which was a heavy weapon of 1948. They brought with them about 60 rifles. Many of those rifles were at least semi-automatic rifles. They also have several automatic submachine guns. Everything, all these weapons were brought from Egypt just 5 days before the attack. Even the Haganah didn't know anything about them. As a matter of fact, this weaponry was the tragedy of Deir Yassin. Why? Because if the people of Deir Yassin wouldn't have weapons, they would run away. Because when the attackers attacked Deir Yassin, they warned the inhabitants of Deir Yassin before the attack to evacuate the village. And from the 1,000 inhabitants of Deir Yassin, 700 villagers ran away and evacuated the village. 200 were captured by the attackers and then freed safely in Arab Jerusalem, and 101 people were killed. Now, if they wouldn't have the arms, they would run away, all of them, and be saved. But because they had the weapons, so many weapons, they believed that they will be able to cope with the attacking Jews. And because of the battle, which continued for 10 hours, so many people were later on killed.
But the video says that they were secure because they had a signed peace or agreement with neighboring villagers. My question then is, why did they need all these weaponry if they felt secure?
There was an agreement, not a peace agreement. There was an agreement between them and Givat Shaul neighborhood, signed in January 1948, 3 months before that, but no one took this agreement seriously. They purchased weapons. They participated in shooting against Givat Shaul, and they participated later on in the battle over Castle and in other operations. So basically, neither the Jews nor the Arabs took this agreement very seriously. And when we reach April 1948, the villagers of Deir Yassin are expecting an attack. It was not a surprise for them. They knew that after Castle, it is their turn. Now, they didn't know that Etzel and Lehi were going to attack them. They knew that they expected that they will be attacked by the Haganah. Eventually, it was Etzel and Lehi. But they expected, actually, several hours before the attack, they declared a state of emergency, and all the armed combatants, about 70 to 80 armed combatants, went to their position in order to be ready for the attack.
Anytime people die, we feel bad. Well, unless they're criminals or some people who we know for sure deserve to die. But so the people that died with the weapon in their hand does not bother me that much, unless they're Jews, and then it bothers me for different reasons when they die, when they get killed. But the announcer there said that after the battle had ended, the Jewish fighters killed about 110 Arabs, most of them women, children, and the elderly. Please comment on this. After the battle ended, the Jewish fighters killed women,
the story
children.
of a massacre after the battle had ended is a fake, is a legend. All of those killed were killed during the hours of the battle. And since I know everyone that was killed, and since I know how everyone was killed, I can tell you precisely that there was no killings after the battle ended. Basically, when the battle ended, the killing stopped.
But then they also quote a guy, I never heard of him, but he is indicated there as a professor from Arizona University, Charles Smith, who says that Jewish fighters simply threw grenades into houses and mutilated women and children. Bodies were thrown down the well, jewelry stripped off, so there was, robbery of the dead people there, and fingers were cut off. Fingers, I guess he implies that they cut off the finger in order to get their rings or some other jewelry, and earlobes cut off. What do you say about his statement?
Well, Carl Smith doesn't know anything about Deir Yassin. So it's the same as many people, other people who are talking about Deir Yassin, they really don't know nothing about Deir Yassin. If you're studying the village for 5 years, then you know something or even more than something about Deir Yassin, but they never studied it. They're just talking without any justification. So I mean, it is without point to react to what he had to say, because I mean it's unimportant. He just like many other professors saying things without any base.
That does not. If what you are saying is correct, and I tend to believe you, that does not do for this so-called professor any honors. But the witness, this guy that was shown there, says that Jewish fighters told the baker to throw his son into the oven. I did not understand if the son was alive or dead.
No. I know this story too, as I know all the stories about Deir Yassin, and I related to it also in the book. And it happened early in the morning when only women were there, not the witness who said only women were there. They were baking their bread for breakfast, and when the attackers entered the bakery, immediately when they saw the baker and his son, they shot them to death. There was no story about throwing live people into the oven. I know that later on this legend turned out, but the real story is that when the attackers broke into the bakery, they shot both of them, and they didn't touch any of the women, let all the women to run away.
So this guy, when he was a little boy, and he says what he says, lies, or he just
I don't know. As far as
remembers
I know,
it the wrong way?
Look, many years has passed since then, and the story about throwing these two people into the oven alive spread well over during the years. But as far as I know from the eyewitnesses, and I use for this only Arab eyewitnesses, there were, besides the baker and his son, there were only women when it happened.
Because he says that father and 3 other people were thrown into the oven.
No, he said about the father and the son. This is a story.
And the son, okay.
But as far as I know, they were both shot when the attackers broke into the bakery.
Then this Yaakov Keller, Haganah veteran, he says that he does not even know if he is a Zionist anymore, but he says that the fighters, Jewish fighters, took the Arabs that remained, placed them in a car, I guess truck, and went into Jerusalem, where an announcer says that they were parading them through the streets of Jerusalem, basically bragging about what the announcer says, the atrocities that they have committed. What do you say?
I followed the track of the prisoners. I mean, Etzel and Lehi had to get rid of the prisoners. They couldn't keep them, and they had to bring them to Arab Jerusalem. And since I have so many eyewitnesses seeing this caravan of lorries bringing the prisoners from Deir Yassin to Arab Jerusalem, I could reconstruct the entire journey from Deir Yassin to Arab Jerusalem, and they took the shortest way possible to get rid of the prisoners.
Yeah. What made
delivered them safely to the Arabs.
What made me suspicious about the veracity of this testimony and what the announcer said, because announcer seems like quoted a newspaper of that time and they underlined several lines there. But then anybody who wants to see can go back and see right what they underlined. It says that Haganah took the prisoners and turned them over to British. So what the announcer said that they were trying to hide their crime seems like not very credible argument, because Haganah takes the prisoners and turns them over to British. This is not an attempt to hide the crime. This is an attempt to actually expose what took place.
Well, both the Haganah and the British claimed that they were the one who rescued the prisoners, but it is baseless. It was Herzl and Lehi who brought the prisoners to Arab Jerusalem, and both the stories of the Haganah and the British were without any foundation. There were reasons why they said that, but I'm discussing everything about it in the book. There were reasons why they decided to invent these stories. When both the Haganah and the British had a problem with the Deir Yassin affair. This is why they invented here and there some stories. But also this fellow from the Haganah who gave a testimony that you showed me, when all the people of the Haganah came later on, they didn't see what happened in the village during the battle, except for 2 units of Palmach, but they didn't say that there was a massacre, the unit of Palmach. The commander also left, he was later on killed during the war, but he left a report about his participation in the Battle of Deir Yassin, the commander of the Palmach, and he said nothing about the massacre. And all those people, like the ones that was giving a testimony here in the extract that you showed me, they didn't were in the village when it happened. They only came afterwards. Also, Gichon, he came about half an hour after the end of the battle. So basically what they saw, and they did see it, was bodies, many bodies. But they didn't see how these people were killed. And also all the photos in the archives, which are forbidden photos, are only photos of dead people. They don't show a massacre in operation, in action. And when you show me the first film, and it showed a picture of many dead Arabs, come on, this is a picture, a known picture from Sabra and Shatila. And I know that they are using pictures from Sabra and Shatila as if they were pictures from Deir Yassin. But anyone who is familiar with the period and the clothing of the people and the houses knows that this has nothing to do. I mean, the bodies are wrapped with white nylons. It didn't exist even in 1948. So it's just a fake.
Are there actually photos of the dead Arabs?
There are photos of dead people in the IDF archives. By the way, even that army, and it was supported by the Israeli Supreme Court of Justice, declined to release all the documents, I managed to use all the forbidden documents in my book.
Wow. So this is, so basically your book has all the photos that they...
No, not the photos. I used all the documents. The photos.
Of the documents. What about the photos?
The photos are only of dead people. People saw them, they're only of dead people. You don't see someone with a machine gun killing people. You see bodies of people. And of course...
Why Israel does not release those photos?
I'm asking a better question. Why they're hiding those documents? Because I managed to use all of them, and I can tell you that there is nothing to hide. So this is a way of thinking.
But I think that they should release
administration, you know, bureaucracy. This is a way of thinking of bureaucracy.
Yeah, they should release all.
There is no real reason to continue to hide this material.
Yeah, I think it would do a lot of good if they released all the photos and all the documents from that time.
I mean, it's ridiculous. One of the arguments that the government put before the Israeli Supreme Court of Justice was that if they will release the material, it will endanger the ongoing negotiations with the Palestinians, which means that they will keep it closed until the Messiah comes.
Yeah. Maybe they would improve the Israeli side instead. In danger. But anyway,
I think that should release the documents.
This witness, Otman Akel, he says that after the battle, so the fighters, Jewish fighters, left alone the very young kids, but they took what I understood to be 15 Arab youth, maybe teenagers, maybe more, put them up the wall and shot them.
No, he's referring to that affair that I mentioned about. It was not 15, it was 11 people from 11 people that were killed by one Etzel soldier. I already described the affair, this episode, several minutes before, and he's referring to that episode. This was the only issue. It was not, I mean, he's saying it put them against the wall, nothing like that. And of course, it didn't happen after the battle, it happened during the battle. Now, many years passed away. I'm not sure that he saw it with his own eyes, but it is possible that he saw it with his own eyes, but it happened during the battle, and it was just one single case of 11 people killed. Okay. By one Etzel soldier who was later on rebuked by his commanders, but it was already too late.
Okay, now we'll see a video for defense prepared by another Jewish channel called Unpacked. We have cut it to show, so it's just a few minutes. And after that, I'd like you to also comment. Maybe they made some mistakes. I do not know if they talked to you about it, but we'll see what they shown. And
November 29th, 1947. That's when the United Nations voted to adopt Resolution 181, partitioning the mandate for Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. While the Zionist leaders reluctantly accepted the result, the Arabs emphatically rejected the vote. They resented international outsiders deciding what happened to what they saw as their land, and were determined to defeat any effort to establish a Jewish state in any part of mandatory Palestine. A new wave of violence between Arabs and Jews broke out right away, initiated by Arab violence, stabbings, shootings, road blockades, and some bombings. This was the beginning of the first phase of the war, before the entire region was engulfed in an interstate conflict in May 1948. From November 1947 to March 1948, the Arab forces continued to increase their attacks. They had the upper hand, with thousands of volunteer fighters from surrounding Arab countries infiltrating the region. Among other things, some of these forces organized a siege of Jerusalem, trapping the 100,000 Jewish residents of the city and preventing shipments of food or supplies. The effects were devastating. The main Jewish fighting force, the Haganah, made many attempts to break through the blockade, but simply couldn't. Nearly all of its armored vehicles were destroyed, and hundreds of its fighters were killed trying to bring supplies to Jerusalem. Israelis feared the Arab forces would win. By the end of March 1948, the situation for the Jews was so desperate that the US seriously considered withdrawing its support for the UN's partition plan because they became convinced the Jews would lose against the Arabs. Meanwhile, the Arab fighters now felt they had the military strength to put an end to the partition plan and prevent a Jewish state from being established. By April 5th, the Haganah was desperate, but ultimately they launched Operation Nachshon, a military operation aimed at breaking the siege of Jerusalem by opening the road from Tel Aviv. The Arabs had been able to block supplies to Jerusalem by controlling several strategic vantage points along the highway, from which they ambushed and fired on Israeli convoys. Deir Yassin was one of those strategic locations. It was less than a mile from the Jerusalem suburbs and was on a hill that overlooked a large portion of the city. So, it was placed on a list of Arab villages to be taken over as part of Operation Nachshon. By the time the Jewish forces decided to advance into Deir Yassin, most of the Arab villages to the west of Jerusalem had already been abandoned by the residents. The battle took place on April 9th, 1948. What happened that day is the subject of much disagreement, but here's what seems clear. Even though the Haganah planned Operation Nachshon, the move against Deir Yassin was actually carried out by two smaller paramilitary groups, the Irgun and Lehi. Although these fighters lacked the training and equipment of the Haganah, they didn't anticipate any major resistance and felt that they could achieve their goals. So, in the early morning of April 9th, 120 men from the Irgun and Lehi arrived at the village in two groups. They brought along a van with a bullhorn to deliver a message in Arabic that the villagers should put down their weapons and flee. Now, it's not clear whether the warning message was ever sent though, and if it was, whether it was heard by the inhabitants of the village. According to Benny Morris, the van overturned in a ditch and fierce fighting ensued. Abu Mahmoud, an Arab villager, told the BBC in 1998 that he did hear the warning from the van. Some accounts don't mention any warning though, and instead present the advance on Deir Yassin as a premeditated plot to murder its residents. Former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who was the leader of the Irgun at the time of the attack, said that a substantial number of residents actually did leave the village before the fighting began, having heeded the warnings from the arriving Jewish troops. So it's not clear how many people in Deir Yassin actually heard the warnings. Still, all agree that the Arabs who stayed offered fierce resistance, which surprised the Irgun fighters. In response, the Jewish troops used hand grenades, killing many. including both armed and unarmed civilians. The question, though, is why? According to Begin, the clash was a house-to-house battle in which the use of hand grenades was necessary. Professor Daniel Gordis argues that the ill-prepared Irgun fighters used the grenades in a panic when their communications equipment failed and they were fired upon by residents. According to Benny Morris, the Irgun fighters used grenades only under great pressure, having been pinned down by fire at each house. Some sources, on the other hand, view the throwing of hand grenades into houses as a deliberate tactic to increase casualties. Fahime al-Mustafa Zaidan, who was 11 years old at the time, later reported that the Jewish forces blew the door down, entered, and started searching the place. They got to the storeroom and took us out one by one. They shot the son-in-law, and when one of his daughters screamed, they shot her too. We all started screaming and crying, but were told that if we did not stop, they would shoot us all. They then lined us up, shot at us, and left. Yehuda Avner, a future Israeli diplomat who was living in nearby Beit HaKerem at the time, described in his diary that he heard explosions that morning from Deir Yassin and went over to investigate. He wrote that he saw prisoners taken around town, in lorry with their hands up, ideas to bolster morale, rumored they were to be shot. Walking home, we saw the captured women and children in a truck. They just stared, many Jews around. I felt ashamed the way they cheered. In total, among the Jewish forces, 4 were killed and 40 were wounded. And now is when we start to get to some of the false reports. At the time, many sources, including the Haganah, Irgun, Arab reports, the head of the Red Cross in Jerusalem, and the New York Times said the death toll was closer to 200 or 250 Arabs. Today, these casualty numbers are regarded as highly exaggerated. The accepted figure of 107 for the Arab death toll comes from a 1988 investigation by a Palestinian university. But what makes the saga of Deir Yassin so controversial isn't just the number of people killed. There's also the question of whether atrocities were committed by the Irgun and Lehi forces. And most importantly, how the legend of the Deir Yassin massacre and the propaganda surrounding it led to fear among the Palestinian Arabs. Many horrific reports were spread by the Arabs in the days after the attack. There was the account of surviving villagers being paraded through Jewish neighborhoods of West Jerusalem before being summarily executed, and the claim that many women and children were brutally slaughtered at Deir Yassin, publicized in a broadcast by the Arab headquarters in Ramallah. Some reports from Israelis who were eyewitnesses to the fighting or arrived shortly thereafter did testify to seeing some horrible things like executions. But some of the claims of atrocities certainly appear to have been fictitious. Arab reports at the time stated that there were multiple instances of rape, especially of school children, which the Irgun fighters immediately denied. Now, these allegations persist to this day, despite the fact that both Israeli and Palestinian scholars have concluded that there is no evidence whatsoever of rape having taken place. That said, some reports do suggest that the actions of the Irgun and Lehi fighters show an indifference to human life. The Haganah also benefited from spreading the story and building up the tragedy to show the world that the Irgun was not fit to lead the fledgling state. Meanwhile, Arab sources cited Deir Yassin as the impetus for carrying out Hadassah convoy massacre 5 days later. In that attack, a convoy bringing supplies and personnel to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem was ambushed by Arab forces, resulting in the deaths of 78 doctors, nurses, students, patients, faculty members, and Haganah fighters. From the Arab perspective, they also hoped that the image of atrocities committed by Jews against the Arab population would mobilize the Arab countries to intervene in the conflict. For example, Arab leader Hussein Khalidi told a Palestinian news editor at the time, "We must make the most of this." The Palestine Broadcasting Service then issued a press release stating that at Deir Yassin, children were murdered, pregnant women were raped, all sorts of atrocities. It's also clear that the Arab propaganda created a legend among ordinary people and soldiers about the ferocity of the Irgun fighters, spreading panic at the mere mention of the organization. Begin wrote, "Not what happened at Deir Yassin, but what was invented about Deir Yassin helped to carve the way to our decisive victories on the battlefield. The legend was worth half a dozen battalions to the forces of Israel. And for those who wanted nothing more than for the Arabs to just leave, these stories only prompted more Arabs to flee their homes, ultimately making them refugees." The hyperbole surrounding the events of that day, in which the Arabs wanted to demonize the Jewish enemy to rile up local Arabs and inflame the entire Arab world, was so effective that it did just that. It terrified the Arabs to the point that many fled, ultimately becoming refugees of the war.
Eliezer, what do you think?
Well, I'll tell you, I will summarize everything that was said there. Basically, Deir Yassin was a tragedy that emanated from the fact that Etzel and Lehi didn't understand that they are going to face a fierce opposition. They didn't know anything about the weapons of the villagers. They thought that they are just going to enter there, all the Arabs will flee, and they will conquer the village. On the other end, there were the villagers. Now, the villagers didn't understand that it was going to be something new. Namely, before Operation Nachshon, no Arab village was taken for good by the Jews. It was only hit and run operations, and then the Jews would leave the village after blowing several houses, etc. So the people of Deir Yassin, when they were attacked by Irgun and Lehi, they believed it's going to be the same, namely that the attackers will blow up several houses, will kill several people, and then run away. So there was a reason to continue to fight them in order to make them run away earlier. They didn't understand that this time, contrary to former occasions, the Jewish attackers were going to fight until they will conquer the village. This was the reason why there was such a fierce battle between the two sides and why there were so many casualties. However, contrary to what one may believe, the reason why the Arabs fled Palestine was not because the rumors of the number of people killed. Many people were killed in Palestine in this war. The reason for the flight was the allegations of rape, as was mentioned in the film. Namely, people believed, as one of them, I will tell you a testimony by one of the women survivors of Deir Yassin. She related that she came to Arab Jerusalem, and then one of the Arab women in Jerusalem told her, I heard that every woman in Deir Yassin from the age of 6 to 70 was raped. So the women from Deir Yassin told her, it's a lie, it never happened. So the women from Jerusalem told her, Uskuti ya kazbana, namely, shut up, you are a liar. It is known by everyone that every woman in Deir Yassin was raped. So people were afraid from the rape stories. Many people later on gave testimonies that they were willing to fight against the Jews because they were not afraid of being killed, but they didn't want to put the women, daughters, and wives in a position that they will be raped. And therefore, eventually, they preferred to live in order not to endanger the women and daughters. So basically, the rape allegations were the main reason why people decided to flee Palestine after the Deir Yassin affair. So it was an invention made by the one that was mentioned there, Hussein Fakhri al-Khalidi, who was the secretary of the Arab Higher Committee, who was representative of the Grand Mufti in Jerusalem, and it was invented by him in purpose in order to lay pressure on the Arab states surrounding Palestine to invade and help the Palestinians against the Jews, but it boomeranged, namely, it caused the Palestinians themselves to decide to leave Palestine. And the numbers of those Palestinians who are leaving Palestine after Deir Yassin is about 10 times more than the Palestinians who left Palestine before Deir Yassin.
Well, you just argued, and in the book you bring some valid documents and arguments that Deir Yassin massacre was just a myth, a figment of imagination on the part of Palestinian Arab leaders whose purpose was to bring the surrounding Arab armies into the battle. But in a fragment that we did not show in this last video, there is Yehoshua Zettler, who was a Lehi commander of that operation.
No, he was a Lehi commander in Jerusalem, not of the operation.
Not in that operation?
Supreme commander in Jerusalem.
He was in Jerusalem, but not in that operation.
No, he was a supreme commander of Lehi in Jerusalem. He didn't participate in person in the operation, but he was he remained near the village during the battle.
Because I thought that because they indicated that he was a commander of that operation.
No. The commander was called Ptachia Zelibansky. He was above him. He was a supreme commander of the entire force of Lehi in Jerusalem.
This Yehoshua Zettler was the commander overall. Was he in that village at that time?
He didn't enter the village. He stayed in Givat Shaul.
because they quote him, and this is a big problem then with this last video. They quote him where he denies that his men carried out a massacre in Deir Yassin, but admitted that they put explosives in every home, causing the inhabitants to run away. Now, throwing grenades into houses sounds to me like a massacre of civilians.
No, the question is, what is the reason that you are throwing the hand grenade? If you are in a life danger and you want to silence a fire, then you throw a hand grenade. I mean, it's very easy to you, to sit in your library and say, come on, you should be better be killed and not endanger civilians that you don't even know that they are there. What you are trying, and Zettler said, I know the citation from Zettler. He said it was a matter of me or him, not in person because he wasn't in the battle, but namely either that I'm being killed or the one shooting at me is being killed. And they just wanted to save their life by killing the ones that were shooting at them. This is definitely not a massacre. I mean, when you throw a hand grenade into a house, it caused many people to die, but this is not a massacre if you are doing it under battle conditions. The question which differentiates between a massacre and a battle is the fact, are you doing it when you are in no danger? You're taking people after the battle. You're lining them against the wall and killing them when there has no weapons, or that you are doing it in the midst of a battle in order when you are in a life danger and you want to save your life.
Why
you
did he
cannot
say,
expect someone to decide, I will get killed, but not kill a civilian also.
I understand what you're saying. What you're saying now sounds reasonable to me, and I agree with what you said. But why then did this Yehoshua Zettler says that the fighters put explosives in every home?
No, he exaggerated. There were 144 houses in Deir Yassin, and I checked an aerial photo of before and an aerial photo of after. I managed to find everything like that, and I managed to reveal that I think about 5 houses were demolished.
That's all?
About 5 the attackers themselves in a press conference later on said that they think that 12 houses were demolished. This was also an exaggeration. They also exaggerated in the number of people killed. This was the beginning of the 254 number.
So I guess
the real number was about 5 houses demolished, and also all the Arab witnesses who spoke about demolishing houses also said that the number of houses demolished was around 5.
That sounds very differently than every home.
No, if he was saying every home, I don't believe that he meant every home because he knew the truth. I mean, you can say 12 instead of 5. Okay, that's reasonable. But you wouldn't say every home. I mean, Deir Yassin is one of the villages who remained with all the houses after the battle. They are now using it for mental hospital. They are using now the houses. It's one of the rare cases in the 1948 war when almost all the houses remained intact. So, I mean, it's nothing to do with the stories that every house was demolished.
Eliezer, I thank you very, very much for stopping by. You have convinced me to the extent that I wanted to be convinced. And as I said, regardless whether I'm a Jew, I'm for Israel, and regardless whether the massacre was committed or not, I would still be a Jew and still for Israel. I mean, that would not affect me one way or the other. But when we commit, in reality, when some Jews, for the sake of our cause, commit atrocities, I cannot tolerate. I cannot tolerate killing of children, raping of women, and you have proven, and your book, for anybody who wants to take a look at it, at the documents and everything else that Eliezer made available. Great job. 5 years of your life, really, really worthwhile cause. I thank you very much. And the link to the book, The Massacre That Never Was, The Myth of Deir Yassin and the Creation of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, the link to it is going to be right below this video. So anybody can go and purchase. I purchased a digital edition Kindle. It's only $12.99. Very, very valuable addition to our political and psychological self-education. I do not think that the book or books like this would convince our enemies or in any way, shape, or form, but for our own self, a person needs to get acquainted with the facts and with this particular event that took place in order to know that even in such circumstances, we have not done what this our enemies say, that commit genocide or this or this or this and this. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your work, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you.